The transport shuttle shuddered as it descended onto the black rock of Draxus 4, the barren moon where legends were either born or broken. The recruits inside stared at the landing pad through narrow slits of reinforced glass. A jagged fortress of steel loomed ahead, lightning dancing across its surface like veins of living energy. This was Crucible Base, the galaxy's most feared training ground. No species entered its gates without sacrifice. Some left scarred, many never left it. The shuttle door hissed open. Recruits of every kind stepped out, towering Vakari with their armored mandibles, Bracken whose skin glimmered like obsidian, Lutari with their coiled serpentine bodies. Each one had trained for years, some for decades, preparing for this. Then came a human. His boots struck the platform with no ceremony. Jackson Reeve, 19 years old, lean, broad-shouldered, unarmed. Compared to the monstrous frames around him, he looked like a child standing among titans. A ripple of laughter spread through the recruits. One Bracken muttered, his gravelly voice carrying through the air, "Fragile species. He'll be the first corpse we bury." A Vakari recruit clicked his mandibles, amused. Perhaps the Commandant wants entertainment before the breaking begins. Jackson ignored them. His gaze wasn't on the recruits but on the fortress itself. He studied it the way a hunter studies a beast, calm, alert, and unshaken. Then the ground trembled. From the steel gates emerged Sergeant Threx, the Vakari drillmaster. His carapace bore scars older than most recruits. His forearms folded behind his back, his mandibles twitching with disdain. His voice boomed like thunder. "Welcome to the Crucible. You are not warriors. You are not soldiers. You are prey. And this moon," he jabbed a claw toward the sky, "will decide if you can survive the hunt." The recruits stiffened. Some swallowed hard, others roared with bravado. Jackson simply watched, unreadable. Threx's compound eyes scanned the crowd and paused on the lone human. His mandibles twitched again, this time not in amusement, but in curiosity. "Earthborn," he growled. "Your kind has no wars, no fleets, no empire. What gives you the delusion you belong here?" The recruits chuckled. Even the storm above seemed to pause, waiting for the boy's humiliation. Jackson met Threx's gaze. His voice was steady. "Because I don't stop." The words were simple, unpolished, but in them was no arrogance, only conviction. The laughter faded into silence. Threx tilted his head, clicking his mandibles softly. He had heard countless boasts in his ears, but rarely had a recruit spoken without bravado. Rarely had one spoken as if it were simply fact. With a grunt, Threx turned away. "We will see. The Crucible devours the weak. If you survive the first trial, Earthborn, then maybe, just maybe, you're worth my time." The gates yawned open. A storm of plasma and rain lashed the recruits as they marched inside. Lightning flashed across the fortress walls, casting shadows like skeletal hands clawing at the sky. The recruits muttered to one another, their eyes flicking back to the human who dared walk as if he belonged. No one admitted it, but a seed had been planted. Doubt, fear, curiosity. The Crucible was a place where entire species struggled for years to endure a single trial. And now, one untested human had stepped into its jaws. The storm howled overhead. Somewhere deep within the fortress, alarms blared, signaling the first test was ready. And as Jackson Reeve passed through the gates, the galaxy's deadliest recruits couldn't help but wonder, had they just witnessed the arrival of a corpse doobie, or the rise of something far more dangerous. The recruits stood at the edge of an enormous canyon, the air shimmering with heat. The walls stretched so high they disappeared into the storm clouds above. Molten rivers snaked below, glowing like veins of fire across the black stone. This was the Gauntlet, the Crucible's opening trial. A course designed not to test skill, but to break spirits. Bridges of crumbling steel spanned the molten rivers. Spikes jutted from the canyon walls, Acidic rain hissed as it fell, eating through armor with cruel patience. Every few moments, bursts of plasma erupted from vents. A warning to anyone too slow. Sergeant Threx's voice thundered over the storm. Survive the gauntlet, or die. No one will save you. Move. The signal flare streaked into the air. The trial began. The Vakari roared, sprinting forward with 4 arms, propelling them across collapsing bridges. The Bracken charged, their armored hides deflecting sparks of plasma. The serpent-bodied Lutheri slithered across walls, defying gravity. And Jackson Reeve. He moved with a steady pace. No rush, no panic. His eyes scanned the course, calculating every path as if he were memorizing a map only he could see. Within minutes, the air filled with screams. A Luthari slipped on a rain-slick wall and plummeted into the molten river. A Bracken leapt too far, his foot slipping, leaving only silence as he disappeared into the flames. The gauntlet didn't care about strength or size. It punished hesitation. It punished fear. Jackson reached the first collapsing bridge. Recruits scrambled, tripping over each other, their weight breaking the rusted metal. Jackson didn't follow the pack. He slowed, waited for the crowd too thin, then sprinted forward light on his feet, balanced, precise. The bridge gave way beneath him. For a split second, he hung in the air above the lava. Gasps echoed from recruits watching. Then hand shot out, catching the last intact bar. With a grunt, he swung himself forward, landing hard on the other side. Impossible, a Vakari hissed, mandibles clicking in disbelief. But Jackson didn't pause to answer. He kept moving. Plasma. Vents erupted ahead, spraying fire across the path. Recruits dove for cover, some to slow their screams cut short as fire consumed them. Jackson dropped low, rolling between bursts with perfect timing. His instincts, sharper than training manuals could ever teach. Halfway through the course, the recruits were already breaking down, armor dented, faces scorched, limbs trembling. Years of preparation crumbling under the reality of the gauntlet. And Jackson. His uniform was scorched, his skin blistered, but his breathing was steady. His rhythm never broke. Where others strained, he moved like a soldier on a long march, as though this inferno was nothing more than another brutal exercise back on Earth when he scaled the final cliff. Fingers bleeding as he hauled himself over jagged stone, the other recruits were still trapped behind walls of fire and falling. Steel. Jackson reached the end and collapsed on one knee, chest heaving, eyes narrowed. Not broken, not beaten, just tired. Sergeant Threx watched from above, mandibles twitching. His gaze lingered on the human longer than any other recruit. He had seen Bracken warlords fail here, Vakari champions fall, screaming into the fire. Yet this boy, this fragile earth, born stewed, where seasoned killers faltered. The storm above crackled, thunder rolling across the canyon. Jackson Reeve lifted his head, sweat and ash streaking his face. For a moment, he looked less like a recruit, and more like a survivor. And in Crucible Base, survival was everything. The training yard was silent. Only the crackle of scorched torches and the hiss of cooling metal filled the air. The recruits stood in a wide circle, sweat dripping from their brows, eyes fixed on the lone figure in the center, Jackson Reeve. The human dot the gauntlet had scarred them, all blistered skin, fractured bones, minds haunted by the screams of those who didn't make it. But the human, he looked, as though the trial had been another drill. His hands were cut, his uniform burned, yet his eyes carried no defeat. And that silence was worse than any mockery. It was disbelief. It was fear. A Bracken warrior leaned toward a Vakari beside him, growling low so only sharp ears could catch it. No human survives the gauntlet on his first attempt. He cheats. He must. The Vakari's mandibles clicked in agreement. Or he hides something. Something not natural. Whispers spread like wildfire through the crowd. The Lutheri hissed in their own tongue, serpentine eyes flicking toward the human with suspicion. The youngest recruits exchanged glances, uncertain whether to fear Jackson or follow him. But Sergeant Threx said nothing. His black compound eyes never left the human, watching with a predator's patience. Then came the sparring drills. Pairs were called into the sand pit. Claws against blades, tails against shields. Training meant blood, but not death, at least, not usually. Jackson's turn came quickly. His opponent, a Vakari, nearly twice his height, carapace glistening like obsidian armor. The alien sneered as they circled each other. Human prey. I will break you before the others. The crowd leaned forward, eager. A chance to see the Earthborn exposed at last. The signal horn blared. The Vakari lunged. 4 arms, each tipped with claws sharp enough to tear steel, slashed in a flurry of practiced strikes. The sand hissed as they cut through the air. Jackson ducked, rolled, shifted. His movements weren't beautiful, weren't refined. They were messy, improvised. He didn't block like a trained warrior. He bent, twisted, turned the Vakari's weight against him, then dash impact. The Vakari slammed into the ground with a crash that shook the pit. The crowd roared, half in shock, half in rage. The human hadn't struck a single blow. He'd simply redirected the Vakari's momentum, tripping him with perfect timing. Lucky, one Bracken shouted. But when the Vakari roared back to his feet and lunged again, Jackson repeated the trick. Twist, pivot, leverage. The Vakari hit the ground harder this time, his mandibles cracking against stone. The whispers grew louder. Not luck. He sees them before they move. No one fights like that. One by one, the recruits began to understand. Jackson didn't win through raw power. He won through something more dangerous. Instinct, adaptation, improvisation. By the 3rd takedown, the Vakari didn't rise. Blood dripped from his mandibles. Rage replaced by humiliation. The yard was silent again. All eyes turned to the human standing calmly in the sand, breathing steady, as though the fight had cost him nothing. Sergeant Threx finally stepped forward, his shadow stretching long across the pit. His mandibles clicked once slow, deliberate. Luck breaks after the first blow. This was not luck. The recruits looked at one another uneasily. If the Vakari couldn't break him, who could? For the first time since Jackson had arrived, the others didn't see prey. They saw a question, and questions are far more dangerous than enemies. The recruits stood at the base of a cliff so tall, it vanished into storm clouds above. Jagged black stone cut upward like the spine of a dead god, its surface slick with acid rain. Gravity fluctuated in waves, engineered to pull twice, sometimes 3 times harder than normal. Every few minutes, the cliffside shuddered as boulders tore loose and plummeted into the abyss below. This was the mountain trial. 3 days of climbing. No rest, no reprieve. Fail to reach the summit, and the crucible left your corpse for the vultures. Sergeant Threx's voice echoed from a high perch. Tools are allowed, rations, if you brought them. No rescue, no shortcuts, climb or fall. The recruits roared in defiance, tightening harnesses, adjusting climbing gauntlets, activating their exo grips. Steel claws bit into rock, alien limbs coiled for leverage. They had prepared for this climb for years. Jackson Reeve had rope, a knife, and nothing else. He stared up at the cliff with calm eyes, then tied the rope around his waist and began to climb. The first hours were chaos. Vakari dug deep into the rock, 4 arms pulling with raw power. Bracken stormed upward, their armored hides scraping sparks against the stone. The serpent-bodied Luthari slithered across vertical faces, moving with unnatural grace. Jackson climbed, with bloody hands. Every stone cut his palms. Every surge of artificial gravity threatened to tear him loose. Twice he slipped, dangling from his rope above the endless drop, boots scraping desperately for purchase. His muscles screamed, but his pace never changed. Steady, deliberate, unbroken. By nightfall, the recruits were spread thin across the cliffside. Rain hammered down in sheets of acid, sizzling on skin and armor. Lightning split the sky, illuminating shadows of bodies dangling where their strength had failed. A Vakari screamed as a gravity surge slammed him against the wall. His harness snapped. His body tumbled silently into the dark. The mountain had claimed another. Jackson clung tight, teeth gritted. The rain burned his skin raw, but he climbed higher, laughing through the pain. Not loud, not wild, just a low, grim chuckle at the cruelty of the test, as if the mountain itself had underestimated him. By the second day, exhaustion tore through the recruits. The bracken slowed, armor weighing them down. The Lutheri shivered in the cold, their scales stiff. Some recruits hung motionless, alive, but unable to go further. And the human, he pressed on, rope biting into his waist, knife jammed into cracks for leverage. When his arms trembled too much to lift, he climbed with his legs. When his legs failed, he pulled with his arms again. Every inch was a war, every breath a battle. By the third sunrise, the summit loomed above a jagged ridge of black stone piercing the clouds. The surviving recruits dragged themselves upward, eyes hollow, bodies broken. But Jackson moved ahead of them. His pace had never quickened, never slowed. Now, as dawn lit the mountain in blood-red fire, he pulled himself over the final ridge and stood on the summit. Wind whipped his burned clothes. Ash clung to his face. His body shook, but he stood tall, alone at the top. For a moment, the human looked like a flag himself, planted not by ceremony, but by survival. Below, the other recruits stared upward, some with awe, others with fury. Sergeant Threx's mandibles clicked, unreadable, but his eyes lingered on the lone figure against a storm. The mountain had broken hundreds before. It had not broken him. The training grounds were silent, not because the drills had stopped, but because exhaustion had stolen. Every sound except ragged breathing and the scrape of boots against stone. The mountain trial had left the recruits half-dead, their hands blistered, their bodies bruised, their minds hollowed. But the crucible never allowed recovery. The moment they returned, Sergeant Threx unleashed the next phase. It was called the attrition. Endless drills, sleepless nights, starvation rations, combat after combat after combat, designed not to kill outright, but to grind away everything that made you want to live. For days, the recruits were marched until their legs collapsed, beaten awake when their eyes closed, thrown into sparring rings even when their bodies could no longer hold a blade. One by one, spirits cracked. A Lutheri hissed for mercy, refusing to rise after a drill. A Bracken, once proud, sat on the ground shaking, food pellet in his hands, tears in his eyes, as he whispered, "Enough. No more." A Vakari warrior turned on his own kind, mandibles snapping in madness. Before collapsing under a stun rod, the crucible devoured them without pity, and in the center of it, all Jackson Reeve. His skin was pale. Lips cracked from dehydration, hands wrapped in torn cloth to hide the bleeding. His body trembled with every step, but when the command came, run, he ran, fight, he fought, stand. He stood. The other recruits couldn't understand it. He had no extra rations, no technology to keep him moving. He should have fallen days ago. Yet when another collapsed beside him, Jackson didn't laugh or gloat. He stopped, lifted them up, and carried them forward until they could walk again. That was what unsettled them most. Most species survived the crucible by isolation, hoarding food, conserving strength. But the human, the weaker he became, the more he gave away. On the 7th night of attrition, the recruits were marched into the Hall of Shadows, a long, dim chamber where blinding lights flared at random, forcing eyes to burn while sonic blasts rattled their skulls. The room was designed to shatter minds already on the edge. A Bracken warrior fell to his knees, hands clutching his ears, screaming. A Vakari slammed his head into the wall, begging for silence. Jackson staggered too. The noise drilled into his bones. His vision swam. His knees buckled. For a heartbeat, the human nearly collapsed. But then he looked at the recruits beside him, broken, helpless, eyes begging for someone, anyone, to move first. Jackson dragged himself upright, one arm slung over a Vakari's shoulder, the other gripping a Bracken's forearm. He forced them to their feet. Then he moved forward, step by step by step. The others followed not because the pain lessened, but because the human refused to stop moving. His will dragged them forward when their bodies betrayed them. By dawn, when the Hall of Shadows ended, half the recruits lay broken behind. But the others, the survivors, looked not at Sergeant Threx, but at the human who had carried them through. For the first time, whispers weren't mocking. They weren't suspicious. They were words of quiet respect. Sergeant Threx stood watching, mandibles clicking in thought. He knew what the recruits didn't. This trial wasn't about endurance alone. It was about leadership, about spirit. And somehow, the Earthborn boy had both. The recruits staggered through the barracks long after midnight. Their bodies were ruined from attrition drills, their eyes hollow from days without sleep. The storm outside pounded against the steel walls, rattling the bunks with every thunderclap. Most collapsed instantly. Some wept softly. Others lay staring into the dark, haunted by the screams of those left behind. And one recruit in obsidian-skinned Bracken watched Jackson reeve with smoldering hatred. The Bracken had once been proud, the strongest of his kin. Now, every drill ended with the human outlasting him, every trial showing the Earthborn boy where the Bracken faltered. The whispers in the yard no longer praised alien champions. They whispered about the human. The Bracken could not allow it, so when the others finally slept, he moved, quiet, careful, tampering with the wiring above Jackson's bunk, loosening the seals on the power conduits that ran along the ceiling. One spark would be enough. One failure, and the crucible would swallow the human whole. He returned to his cot, hiding his grin in the shadows. The barracks erupted in fire an hour later. A blinding explosion tore through the ceiling, scattering shards of metal like knives. Flames poured across the walls, feeding on the oxygen vents. Within seconds, smoke choked the air. Alarms screamed. The recruits woke to chaos, shouting, coughing, scrambling toward the exits. Out, out. Vakari recruits shoved past one another, clawed hands, tearing at the doors. The Bracken stumbled with the crowd, feigning panic. But Jackson didn't run. He coughed, his lungs filling with smoke, eyes burning, but his gaze locked onto a figure crumpled near the flames. The Bracken, unconscious, his skin blackened where the explosion had thrown him against the wall. The same Bracken who had mocked him, the same rival who had tripped him, sabotaged him, cursed his name. Jackson didn't hesitate. He tore a strip of cloth from his shirt, tied it over his mouth, and charged into the firestorm. The heat blistered his skin instantly. Smoke seared his lungs. His vision blurred. But he reached the Bracken, hooked his arms under the alien's bulk, and dragged. Every step was agony. His boots melted against the floor. Sparks rained down, like burning hail. The fire roared in his ears, demanding he surrender, demanding he let go. But Jackson refused. With one final heave, he burst through the smoke and collapsed onto the cold metal outside, dragging the Bracken with him. The recruits, who had escaped, turned in shock. They watched as Jackson coughed violently, his skin blistered, his hands raw, but his grip never loosening from the one he'd saved. The Bracken opened his eyes weakly, confusion drowning his hatred. The human had saved him. Him, the one who tried to destroy him. Silence spread through the crowd. Not whispers this time. Not suspicion. Silence born of something far heavier, respect. Even Sergeant Threx, standing tall against the fire's glow, tilted his head in thought. His mandibles clicked once, slowly, before he spoke. The crucible is cruel. It tests more than flesh. It tests loyalty, mercy, spirit. Tonight, only one of you passed. His eyes locked on Jackson, and no one, not even the Bracken, dared argue. The recruits stood at the edge of a vast desert plain under an artificial sky. The sun above was white and merciless, the air dry enough to crack their lips in seconds. Across the horizon, towers of smoke rose where simulated artillery shells struck. This was the war simulation, a battle crafted by the Crucible's architects to be unwinnable. Each recruit would be placed in a squad, each squad thrown against wave after wave of enemies drawn from the databanks of every known empire. Soldiers, beasts, war machines, all digital, all lethal. Victory was not the objective. Survival was. Sergeant Threx's voice thundered through the desert winds. Fight until you break. Fight until you fall. Only then will you know what you are. A horn blared. The sands shook, and the war began. The first wave descended like a storm. Vakari recruits slashed through swarms of insectoid drones, mandibles clicking in fury. Bracken roared, their armored hides shrugging off plasma bolts as they smashed enemy ranks. Luther slithered through trenches, striking with precision. Jackson's squad, cobbled together from exhausted survivors, rallied around him. He had no orders from Threx, no instructions, just instinct. Dig in, Jackson barked, voice raw but commanding. Use the rock's funnels there, advance. The recruits obeyed, not because of his rank, he had none, but because in his voice there was no doubt. When the enemy charge hit, it broke against them like water on stone, but the simulation adapted. It always did. The second wave brought war machines, hulking brutes, of steel and fire. Their cannons tore through the rocky cover, blasting recruits aside like rag dolls. Panic spread. A Vakari shrieked, mandibles clattering in despair. A Bracken turned to run. Hold the line. Jackson's shout cut through the chaos. He scrambled up the nearest ridge, plasma fire searing the ground around him. With bare hands, he tore free a rusted turret, half buried in the sand, wiring sparking against his arms. Cover me, bullets hissed. Explosions thundered, and then the turret roared back to life in Jackson's grip. He swung it toward the machines, each burst of fire lighting up the desert like a new sun. Metal giants staggered, fell, burning in heaps of molten slag. The recruits stared. The human had turned junk into salvation. By nightfall, the desert had become a graveyard of enemies and friends alike. The sky bled red under simulation code. Exhaustion gnawed at every survivor. And still, the horn sounded for another wave. This time an army. Hundreds of holographic soldiers advanced in perfect formation, their banners black against the false moon. The ground shook beneath their march. The recruits looked to Jackson, fear in their eyes. He was bleeding. His body barely held together. Yet he stood, shoulders squared, gaze locked on the oncoming tide. We don't have to win, he said, voice steady. We just have to show them we won't break. Not here. Not ever. And then he charged, not toward cover. Not into retreat. Forward, straight at the enemy line. The others followed. Vakari roared beside him. Bracken slammed into the tide with earth-shaking fury. Lutheri struck from the shadows. Together, united under one banner that wasn't printed but lived in the unyielding will of one human, they fought. The desert exploded with chaos. Fire lit the night. Metal clashed with bone. And in the heart of it all, Jackson Reeve burned like a torch against the darkness. By dawn, silence. The simulation ended. Smoke cleared. The battlefield was littered with fallen recruits and shattered enemies. But among the survivors every eye turned to the human who still stood, bloody and unbroken. Sergeant Threx descended, mandibles clicking. For the first time, his voice carried no scorn. You led them through the unwinnable. You made them believe. That is war's true victory. The battlefield dissolved. One moment. Jackson Reeves stood in the smoking ruins of the desert plain, blood dripping from his arms, his chest heaving with exhaustion. The next, the world flickered, pixelated, and vanished in a shimmer of light. The desert, the sky, the enemy army gone. In its place was silence, cold. A vast chamber of obsidian stone, its walls carved with the names of those who had endured the crucible across centuries. Thousands of names, thousands of legends. The surviving recruits blinked against the sudden calm. Their wounds remained, their fatigue real. But their weapons and enemies were gone. And then Sergeant Threx appeared. The Vakari drillmaster strode into the chamber, his armored bulk towering above them. His mandibles clicked slowly, deliberately, each sound echoing like a drumbeat of judgment. His 4 black eyes swept over the battered survivors. Then he spoke, of 200 who entered this crucible. His voice thundered, less than 20 remain. The silence grew heavier. Recruits bowed their heads, trembling beneath the weight of his words. Threx's gaze lingered on each survivor in turn. A Vakari warrior who stood on one shattered leg, a bracken still bleeding from a chest wound, a Lutheri who held herself upright by sheer will alone. Finally, his gaze landed on Jackson Reeve. The human swayed on his feet. His uniform hung in rags, his face blackened by smoke and fire, his eyes hollowed by days of torment. Yet still he stood, and in that moment, every other recruit turned not to Threx, not to the walls of names, but to the human who had carried them when their legs gave out, who had dragged them from fire, who had led them into a battle no one could win. Threx's mandibles clicked once more, then spread in what might almost have been a smile. You came from a forgotten world, weak, untested, surrounded by species who believed you nothing more than prey. His voice rose, shaking the chamber. But prey does not lead predators. Prey does not drag warriors through fire. Prey does not stare into the unwinnable and charge forward anyway. Threx stepped closer. His shadow fell over Jackson, but there was no threat in it, no only respect. You are no prey. The chamber lights flared. High above, an ancient mechanism ground into motion, revealing a massive stone tablet etched with glowing runes. Space was carved there for one more name. Jackson Reeve, Threx declared, his voice echoing like thunder across the chamber. You have conquered the crucible. Your name shall be carved among the eternal. The stone glowed brighter as Jackson's name etched itself into history, burning with golden light. The other recruits, Vakari Bracken, Lutheri, watched in silence, their hatred gone, replaced by something far more powerful. Reverence. In that moment, the barriers between species crumbled, because they had all followed him, and they all knew. Without him, none would have survived. Jackson lowered his head, too exhausted to speak. But in his silence, the lesson was already clear.